Today we will look at role of understanding sentences in understanding relationship between language and society. We have two parts in this course. The first part is language, the other part is society. In the study of language, and in particular the study of the structure of language at the level of sentence, the unit of investigation is a sentence. However, in the study of language in the context of society, the unit of investigation happens to be discourse. We have looked at it earlier, and little later we will look at it in details as well, that a discourse is not a random collection of sentences. A discourse has got several other things inbuilt in it to qualify to be called a discourse. Similarly, a sentence is not merely collection of words, it is much more than that. And therefore, we would like to very briefly look at the structure of a sentence and what involves in understanding of a sentence for us to understand the relationship between language and society better. Such a thing will help us appreciate this relationship at a deeper level. Let us understand what goes in making of a sentence. We know that human mind takes input and gives grammatical, infinite, rule governed and systematic output. What makes this output grammatical, infinite, rule governed and systematic is visible at the level of words, sounds, but also at the level of sentences. Today we will be looking at what we mean by grammatical, infinite and rule governed at the level of a sentence. So, we will try to address few questions like what is a sentence, how are sentences made, and how does understanding of a structure of a sentence helps us understand underlying patterns of language and role of human mind in it. We will also look at some constraints on the formation of a sentence. So, let us first look at components of a sentence, and I invite you to look at chapters and other videos on language and mind to appreciate the structure of a sentence at a larger and more detailed level. We will very briefly go through these things for the purpose of this course. There are two parts of a sentence. One is the subject and the other is called the predicate. The two parts, subject and the predicate, also requires us to understand these terms in little bit more details. The definition of the subject happens to be a difficult one. However, there are two ways of looking at the definition of a subject. One is the grammatical perspective and the other is semantic perspective. From grammatical perspective, a subject of a sentence is the element, usually a noun phrase, that agrees with the verb in the predicate. And this agree is an important part which we come to in a minute. Everything other than the subject in a sentence is part of predicate, that is verb, and everything other than the subject. Objects are part of the predicates as they are defined and decided by the nature of the verb. To appreciate this thing, we need to look at the components of a sentence at a different level as well. The parts of the sentence could be put into different categories. One is lexical category and the other is functional category. Things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, prepositions, etc. are going to be part of lexical category. However, elements like number, person, gender, tense, aspect, agreement, where number, person and gender are part of agreement are called functional categories. We will be looking at an example of a sentence to understand this in a better way. So, we have two things, subjects and predicate, then we have grammatical relations, and then we have nouns and verbs. So, what we call a subject and what we call a predicate, and within the predicate we have verbs and objects, these are grammatical relations. A noun does not automatically become a subject, a noun becomes a subject in the context of a sentence. Similarly, a noun becomes an object of a verb, and therefore, because it belongs to a verb, these are called grammatical relations, and then nouns and verbs are lexical units. Let us take the example of a sentence, John loves Mary. John is the subject, loves Mary is the predicate, in which loves, and to be more precise, love is the verb and Mary is the object. John wrote a letter to Mary. John is the subject, wrote a letter to Mary is the predicate, in which wrote is a verb, a letter is a direct object, and to Mary is an indirect object. Both a letter to Mary objects are part of the verb, part of the predicate, and decided by the nature of the verb write. So, we will look at more examples, and then we will see what it means to be a sentence in generative grammar. All grammatical sentences and only grammatical sentences are called sentences. So, the good thing about generative approach of looking at sentences, from infinite set of rules we get, from a finite set of rule we get infinite number of well formed sentences, and the productivity of language becomes clearer by looking at principles and parameters that govern language. So, now we will take you to the sentence again, the sentences that we have seen, and then we will focus on the simpler part. So, when we say John loves Mary, we have looked at the grammatical components and the grammatical relations in terms of subjects and objects, and we know this is a sentence. It has two parts, John as the subject and loves Mary as the predicate. So, what we want here to understand that the marker sa on the verb love, which makes the verb loves, is the marker of an agreement, and in this sentence this marks third person and singular number, which are also apparently the features on the subject NP, which is third person and singular number. So, these two must match, that is, the features on the subject NP must match with the features of the verb, or must be allowed to be present on the verb in order for a sentence to be grammatical, and that yields a grammatical sentence. So, verbs would not usually agree with objects, and they agree with the subjects if there is nothing intervening between them, and then verbs determine whether or not it requires an object. For example, there are two types of verbs at least. One is intransitive verbs and the other is transitive verb. This categorization is looking at the nature of the verb. So, there are two things that are related to the nature of verbs. One is transitivity, the other is intransitivity. Intransitive nature of verb would not allow the verb to take an object. However, the transitive nature of the verb does exactly the opposite. So, a transitive verb will have an object, an intransitive verb will not allow an object. So, in this case we have an object Mary, and that testifies that this verb love is a transitive verb and therefore it allows an object. So, the relationship between the verb and object is very local, that is within predicate, and the relationship between subject and the verb is across the predicate. So, the two components of the sentence, subject and the predicate, must agree in terms of the available features on the verb. These features are parametric in languages. For example, in English, as you have seen in this example, John loves Mary, we have number and person participating in agreement. However, in a language like Hindi, number, along with number, person and number, gender also participates in the agreement, and therefore, a language like Hindi is called a language with grammatical gender. For example, when we say a sentence in Hindi, Raju ne chai pi, we see Raju has got masculine gender on it, apart from this being singular and third person. What we see in this sentence is the verb pina, which is in this case is in perfective aspect, appears with the feminine marker. And then what we find here is the noun Raju, which appears to be the subject of the sentence, does not agree with the verb pina. Remember, in English, only person and number participates in agreement. In a language like Hindi, number, person and gender, all of them would play a role in the agreement features in making a sentence grammatical. Therefore, what follows from that and what we see in this sentence on the screen, Raju ne chai pi, is Raju, what appears to be the subject, does not agree with the verb pina. And that is because of the intervening postposition ne, which is also an ergative case marker. So, a subject in natural languages would agree with the verb or the predicate only if there is nothing intervening between the subject and the predicate. Here, the subject has an overt case marker on it which intervenes the agreement, and therefore, it would not allow the subject to agree with the verb. Now, agreement is an important part in natural language, and particularly in Hindi, the sentence must show agreement. So, what actually ends up happening in this sentence is for the purpose of agreement, the sentence looks for the next available noun which is available for the discharge of agreement, and then the next available noun chai, which happens to be a feminine gender which has feminine gender on it, agrees with the verb pina, and the verb does not agree with Raju. So, in this case, this is an example of grammatical, the agreement which takes care of grammar, and here the NP Raju is not a grammatical subject of the sentence. For the purpose of grammatical subject, chai becomes the grammatical subject of the sentence. However, Raju remains the semantic object. Raju remains the semantic subject of the verb of the sentence. Same thing happens in the next sentence, Seema ne sev khaye. You can see Seema, which carries feminine gender along with singular number and third person, does not agree with the verb eat, and that is because we see a masculine marker on the verb. What we also see the plural marker on the verb, and the subject Seema happens to be reflecting a singular number. So, therefore, there is no way this semantic subject would agree with the verb to take care of the grammatical, to take care of the grammaticality of the subject for this purpose as well. What happens instead is it looks for the next noun, and the noun save, which has both masculine gender on it and plural marker on it, agrees with the verb. Therefore, the noun save happens to be the grammatical subject and Seema happens to be the semantic subject. This also helps us see the split between two types of subjects. So, most of the time in natural languages, we are going to have a grammatical subject and a semantic subject. Most of the time it so happens that grammatical subject and semantic subject, at least in the language like Hindi, happens to be the same NP, and in this case when or at any point where the NP, which is supposed to be agreeing with the verb, carries any other marker, in this case ergative marker, then they will not be allowed to participate in agreement. This is an important feature in the making of a sentence, and the features like person, number and gender are relevant. Languages vary from one another in terms of what is allowed to participate in agreement. Some languages would only allow person and number and not gender. For example, English. Some languages would allow all person, number and gender to participate in the agreement patterns. For example, Hindi. What is interesting to note as a footnote here is there appears to be a hierarchy in these agreement markers. For example, if a language, so see the hierarchy is the following. We have agreement and it is taken care of by three things. They are person, number and gender. What in short they are also called PNG features. What I have observed while working on the syntax of Hindi at least, and I want to share it with you to understand this with clarity, that there appears to be a hierarchy in the three. So look at it. These three things are participating in agreement. If a language allows gender to participate in the agreement, like a language, let us say for example a language like Hindi, and we see gender participating in the agreement like we see in these sentences, then what we see that these two features will definitely be participating in the agreement as well. Whereas, when we see gender, when we see only number and person participating in a language like English, then we need to check, and what we find is gender is not part of agreement in English. The moment we see number participating in agreement in English, it is easy to conclude that person will also be participating in agreement in English. It works with same constraints in Bangla, and there are languages where this is not going to, where none of these features are available. But so it is possible that none of them would participate. It is also possible that only one will participate. It is also possible that two will participate, and it is also possible that all three of them will be participating in agreement. That will make agreement parametric. But what we see as an interesting phenomena is if gender participates in agreement, then the language will also allow number and person to participate. If only number participates in agreement and not in then it is likely that person will participate and not gender, what happens in English. And likewise, Bangla happens to be another interesting thing, and then Malayalam happens to be a language where we don't see any one of these features participating in agreement. This is a very interesting thing about natural language, and this becomes an important part in making of a sentence. So, these are also called 5 features: person, number and gender. And for the purpose of the hierarchy that we have just discussed, we need to put it in this order, and they are called PNG features as well. So, we find all these things participating in the formation of a sentence in a very critical way, and what we see and what we need to discuss little bit more is about the role of tense and aspects. And then we need to know about the conceptual framework of a sentence, and that will complete an understanding about what we mean by a sentence and what is it that we need to see. We mentioned a question, so we have answered what is a sentence and how are sentences made. We have looked at some of the constraints in formation of a sentence, that a sentence must show agreement, and if it agrees with one feature, then it works in a hierarchical fashion. And what we mean by understanding underlying patterns of language and role of human mind in it is the operation, the computation of these agreement features, and the way human mind treats this, where gender becomes grammatical, that is, gender participates in grammar, in the sense that absence or presence of gender in the language will make the sentence grammatical or ungrammatical, and the presence of gender is going to separate what we know as grammatical subject and semantic subject. Such computation helps us understand the role of human mind in processing of sentences, and we understand the role of human mind in processing of sentences only when we look at these intricate details, intricate inherent and innate rules which we do not know, but they operate in our subconscious, and that answers this question. Very soon we will be looking at other parts of the sentences. Thank you.